I welcome you to our first webinar, Achieving Coherence, the HDP Nexus. I'm Sophie Fontaine with Resilience Links. Before we begin, let me orient you to the BlueJeans platform. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see most of your controls. Firstly, if you haven't done so already, please use the chat to introduce yourself. To ask questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A button on the bottom right, and feel free to upvote questions you'd like to see answered in the Q&A portion. If the presentation is too small on your screen, you can use the slide bar at the bottom of your window to adjust your view. And lastly, we are recording this webinar and will email you the post-event resources shortly following the event. You can also find them on resiliencelinks.org. Thank you for your attendance today. I'll now pass it to Jesse Anderson, Senior Conflict Advisor within USAID's Center for Resilience and an author of the new USAID report titled Programming Considerations for HDP Coherence, a note for USAID's implementing partners. Jesse, over to you.
Thanks, Sophie. And welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. So I know for many of us, this is such an important topic, and the call for HDP coherence is only getting louder. So, to me, today's event definitely isn't about having all the answers, but it is about starting a concrete conversation that we can take forward together. So I know that's something I'm really looking forward to over the next hour and a half. So with that in mind, we can head to the next slide. And I'll just give a quick overview of our agenda today and how we'll be spending our time together. Now, in a moment, we'll kick off with opening remarks from Resilience Leadership Council co-chair Alexius Butler. Then I'll be giving a brief overview of the programming considerations. And then next we'll have a panel moderated by USAID's Aaron Rush, as well as with a mix of USAID mission staff and partners from across the HDP Nexus. After that, we'll open up to Q&A with all of you. And then finally, we will hear reflections from USAID colleagues and wrap up with closing remarks from our RLC co-chair, Amy Tohill-Stahl. So with that, and we can head to the next slide again. I am very happy to welcome Alexius Butler, co-chair of the Resilience Leadership Council and acting Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. Alexis will be setting the stage for our event today. So with that, thank you very much, Alexius, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and good morning to everyone. As the co-chair for the agency's Resilience Leadership Council, I'm really looking forward to today's event. Speaking on behalf of the RLC, we know that building resilience, especially in areas of recurrent and protracted crisis, requires HDP coherence. And although we can't control if and when crises occur, there are steps that we can take today to anticipate shocks and build in flexibility. If we want to reduce humanitarian need, it will definitely take coordinated action across humanitarian development and peace programming. The HDP Nexus is something I believe we all know matters, but at USAID, it's also something we've engaged on publicly through high-level commitments such as signing on to the OECD DAC recommendation on the Nexus. And at today's event, with this new paper, we are eager and excited to move the discourse beyond high-level statements and really begin a conversation with our partner community about what HDP coherence looks like in our everyday work. We want to make our commitment to HDP coherence more real and concrete, ultimately to ensure that all of our kinds of assistance, be it humanitarian, development, or peace, add up to something greater than the sum of their parts. The document or paper or programming considerations that we're here to discuss emerged from an internal push at USAID from the field. Immediately, I'd say in like mid-2020, basically around the outbreak of COVID-19, really faced with the devastating second-order economic and social impacts of the pandemic in the countries where we work, USAID colleagues came together to identify our core principles around HDP coherence and to consolidate and map out specific best practices from our missions. After that, albeit overdue and crisis-driven push, we realize we should also be having this conversation with you, our partner community. So what you'll see in the programming considerations also represents consolidated partner practices and experiences gathered from an in-depth set of consultations over about 6 months with 20 USAID implementing partners from across the humanitarian development and peace spectrum. Now, these considerations are also an opportunity for us to share our own thinking in this HDP space and to begin more practical conversation, as I said earlier, together about how we strengthen HDP coherence up ahead. For instance, at USAID, we acknowledge the very real and often frustrating challenges to this work. No matter how necessary, we know it's not easy. So I really want today's conversation to kick off that dialogue on how we can take action right away. I mean, what kind of things can we be doing differently in our work starting tomorrow or this evening or right now? I've really enjoyed hearing some of the creative and exciting ideas from our missions and our partners on the during the consultation process for these programming considerations. And so I'd love to hear from you all as well about your thoughts and suggestions. And then second, we want to clearly identify the challenges that are getting in our way and think about potential solutions. I know we'll get into this in the moderated panel, and I'm definitely looking forward to that discussion as well. But moving ahead, we are committed to advancing the plot in the HDP space. Today is an early step, but it's an important one. And thank you all for joining us. And for coming with your good ideas and suggestions, and we hope that this will all help us to improve our strategic thinking in this realm, as well as our day-to-day work at the agency. Back to you.
Alexius, thank you so much for those remarks. So now we'll head into the overview of the programming considerations, and on this slide here, you can see what you'll find inside the report. So I'll just pause here for a second, but then we can head to the next slide. And we can head to the next slide. You can see the definition we're using for HDP coherence and then that why behind it. I'll let you all read the definition while I elaborate a bit more on the why. So first, and as I know we all know, we are in the midst of compounding crises, from climate change and COVID-19 to rising hunger, inequality, and conflict. And this risk context underscores why it's so important for us to be working together. And I think it also makes it plainly clear that no one kind of assistance alone can solve the problems we're facing. Now, second and related, we know we need more impactful, sustainable assistance to meet today's challenges. And to me, this ties in with our agency's renewed focus on localization. So for our efforts to be more than the sum of their parts, as Alexius mentioned, we need to move away from technical stovepipes and prioritize the local problems and goals that matter most. And HDP coherence can bring us closer to that. So with that kicking around in our minds, we can head to the next slide. Now, I'll walk through the principles in this report and just give some quick illustrative partner examples for each. So the first is around protecting principled humanitarian assistance. And to me, this is really a first principle of sorts. We know principled humanitarian action is key for preserving access and ensuring HA can reduce suffering and save lives. And if we don't get this right, the whole project of HDP coherence is compromised. So in the report, we share examples of what this can look like. And we can head to the next slide. Now, the next principle is to plan jointly and seek a common agenda. And this is really at the heart of making sure our efforts add up to something greater than the sum of their parts. You know, it's about defining the problem together and then establishing that collective goal we're aiming for. And we heard a lot of great examples from partners on this topic. So one was around how partners are conducting joint analysis or sharing analysis. A number mentioned how systems mapping was actually really effective for identifying HDP entry points across organizations. And then another example that comes to mind is about an assessment working group that shared analysis on early recovery in Iraq. So that analysis was shared across the cluster system, and it started to organically prompt longer-term HDP thinking across actors. Yet just one more idea under this bucket was that developing a common agenda in a bite-sized way can be really impactful by establishing practical boundaries around it. So for instance, in Somalia, a markets working group created a common agenda around market support across HDP actors, and this was really successful. So other partners have taken a similar approach by focusing on a particular subnational zone or market catchment area or livelihood zone. And we can head to the next slide. So this principle focuses on how we're coordinating and communicating and learning with each other on an ongoing basis. And here, many partners shared how they're leveraging external structures whenever possible, whether that's the UN, donor-funded, or national structures. But we also heard some really innovative approaches for how partners are organizing themselves internally. So for instance, IRC has a country-level strategic planning process that is sector-agnostic and cuts across HDP. It's in effect forcing problem-driven thinking across the nexus at the country level in all of that country-level planning. And we can head to the next slide. Now, this principle is around sequencing, layering, and integrating. And to me, this is really where the rubber hits the road with HDP coherence. So this is about these different tactics we can use to bring HDP investments together. And I'll just give a couple examples of what this looks like for folks that might not be familiar with the term. So sequencing is about timing intentions to follow one another logically. And a common example here could be where HA programming for displaced people then transitions to DA when people resettle back home. Layering is generally most common, and it's about programming across kinds of assistance that's taking place at the same time and at the same place. And then finally, integration is about blending different kinds of assistance in the same programming. So that could be, for instance, if a development program expands to include HA or peace efforts when a crisis strikes. Now, one example we heard from partners, again among many, comes from Somalia. So here, IOM planned a relocation site for displaced people at risk of eviction. And IOM ended up setting up a task force in collaboration with actors across the nexus. And by doing this, they were able to respond to those IDPs' immediate and long-term needs in the eviction process. Now, another example that is also really exciting, and I think we'll hear from one of our panelists about this later, but partners are using rapid analysis to sequence, layer, and integrate in exciting ways too. So for instance, in DRC, the SAFER Consortium began sharing crisis information and alerts across partners, and they actually used that information to layer and sequence assistance. And we can head to the next slide. Now, this bucket, again, the examples here could be endless, but I'll just pick a few. Shock responsive programming and adaptive management is really about how we pivot in the face of shocks and crises. And again, here's where we had a number of creative approaches. One from Mercy Corps, and related to one of the last examples, is around how Mercy Corps has invested in what they call crisis analytics. So this is nearly real-time local analysis on evolving risks that goes well beyond typical humanitarian data that's common in these contexts and can really inform long-term resilience and peace efforts. We also heard, interesting approaches from partners about their staffing. So for instance, a number of partners described how important it is to devolve decision-making to field teams and local partners. This way they can adapt better in a fast-moving context. But another example comes from the roster of local and sometimes international experts or other organizations that you're working with. So for instance, another example comes from DRC. So while addressing Ebola, a health organization subcontracted to a peace-building organization. And by doing this, they were able to address the rumor and misinformation dynamics that were really hurting the response. And we can head to the next slide. Now, this principle on conflict integration, I want to make it clear that conflict integration at USAID, it includes things that folks I'm sure are very familiar with, conflict sensitivity and peace building, but it also refers more broadly to questioning how our goals and approaches and measures of success contribute to the peace and security that aid impact depends on. So here I just want to note, the P in HDP, it's not just about standalone peace building interventions. It's actually about how we can be seeking peace dividends across all investments. And again, we had wonderful examples from partners on this. One is from the Conflict Sensitivity Resource Facility in South Sudan. So this facility provides ad hoc support through a help desk for HDP actors in country. They also design courses and guidelines specific to South Sudan, and this helps all kinds of actors integrate conflict and violence in their work. Now, another example comes from Mindanao, an example of pursuing peace dividends within sectoral work. Here, WFP intentionally designed a livelihoods program to better reintegrate former combatants. And this program ultimately strengthened social cohesion in local communities as former soldiers returned home. And we can head to the next slide. So this last principle is on local systems and partners. Now, I remember in our consultations, one participant mentioned how local actors are naturally, quote unquote, nexus dwellers, since they're generally thinking about the problems in front of them instead of aid or sector boxes. And I remember that really sticking with me. It made a lot of sense to me. I see this principle as a cornerstone to HDP coherence, which should ideally be centering local problems, goals, and systems. And again, we had some very rich examples in this space. So partners highlighted how they have been conducting local systems analysis, and then a range of ways that they've been empowering local actors and involving them more fully in coordination platforms. Others described partnerships with local and national government that had a huge impact too. And again, this would be when it's appropriate per our first principle on humanitarian principles. So for instance, one consortium partnered with the Haitian government on a social safety net program that was using e-vouchers to reinforce local markets. So then when Hurricane Matthew struck in 2016, the program worked with the government to extend that safety net to respond to new needs on the ground. They were able to quickly target people in hard to reach areas, and they were able to keep supporting local food systems at the same time. Now, we can head to the next slide. So that was the quick run through of the core principles that are sort of giving the scaffolding for this report, these programming considerations, and just a few quick examples of what you can find in the report. But I wanted to note too that the final section of the programming considerations looks at challenges, looks at, as Alexius alluded to, what are these things that are getting in our way? And so I just wanted to note that this partner consultation process we undertook, it didn't just focus on practices that work. We really asked partners about the challenges they're facing and what's getting in their way. And so these are a couple of quotes that just highlight some of those themes. Things that we heard often were about flexible funding, incentives to coordinate, a focus on technical skills instead of HDP skills, especially in key roles like chiefs of party. And then just the fact that we know there are different principles and processes and cultures behind different kinds of assistance. So we will dig into this more in the moderated panel, so I don't want to get into this too much. But my hope for today is that we are striking the right balance between some hopeful optimism that there are practical ways we can be moving the needle towards greater HDP coherence, as well as some pragmatism around these thorny challenges that get in the way. So again, I will now defer this to the moderated panel, but I'm looking forward to digging into this, both ways to change business as usual and an open conversation about those barriers. So with that, let me turn to Erin Rush, Foreign Policy Engagement Team Lead with USAID's Office of Policy. Erin, thank you so much for leading the panel, and over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jesse. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to moderate this really excellent panel today. So as Jesse said, I'm Aaron Resch. I'm the team lead for the Foreign Policy Engagement team in the Policy Office at Usaid. And really, I think echoing what Alexius and Jesse have both said, when I look at this from a policy perspective, this is HDP coherence is such a critical issue. I think more and more Usaid and development agencies in general and development professionals are working in fragile contexts. And more in those contexts, we are providing multiple types of assistance. We have humanitarian programming, sometimes year on year or recurrent, a range of development programs, and often various types of peace building, whether it's stabilization or conflict prevention programming. And yet, I think also, looking bigger picture, as we look at, humanitarian assistance, it's not, keeping pace with the scale of the crisis we're seeing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, development assistance is shrinking relative to other capital flows to developing countries. We're also seeing increasingly complex problem sets, whether it's transnational challenges or intersecting vulnerabilities, overlaid crises, backsliding on development gains. And so I think for all of these reasons, as both Alexius and Jesse said, it's really important that that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, so that we are using our tools cohesively, that we're complementing each other's work. I think that's especially true for delivering on our mission, both our humanitarian mandate, but also advancing sustainable and inclusive development, and particularly development that's inclusive of those who are most vulnerable to those shocks and stresses. And it's also true when we look at the biggest challenges that we're facing right now, whether it's COVID and future pandemic threats, the climate crisis, corruption, rising authoritarianism, protracted conflict. These all sort of touch on all of what we do and require a multi-dimensional, multi-pronged approach. But I think, as we all know, historically, we've approached each part of the HDP Nexus in very different ways, different authorities, different resources, different planning processes, different planning horizons, even cultures internally. And so I think there's a policy question there and about the structural challenges that Jesse just alluded to that we have to make. But so much of this is also about our practice, how we each individually approach our own roles across the nexus. And so I think that's what's so valuable about this report, because it captures principles that are broadly applicable to lots of contexts, but it also just collects so much kind of useful experience and lessons and examples from those contexts that really help provide texture to what we're trying to accomplish together. So it certainly doesn't answer all the questions. I think we have more work to do, but it is just a really valuable resource and important starting point, and something to build on. And I think that's what this panel today will help us do. And so I'm looking forward to a really rich conversation with an excellent group of panelists with a lot of diverse, really deep experience as practitioners in this area. So just to very briefly introduce them, we have 4 panelists. Dina Esposito is the Vice President of Technical Leadership at Mercy Corps. Dustin Caniglia is the Resilience Coordinator for USAID Somalia. Liz Hume is Executive Director of the Alliance for Peace Building. And Mustafa Islami is Senior Advisor for Strategic Partnerships at the International Rescue Committee. So now turning to our panelists, and I'll turn to Mustafa first. So the first question is, from your perspective, Mustafa, at IRC, what does HDP coherence look like in practice for IRC? So curious to hear about IRC's broader positioning on HDP coherence, but then also perhaps if you have specific examples from the field that you can share.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for the question, and thanks to JC and others for organizing this important discussion. First, I'd like to applaud USAID's commitment to HDP coherence programming and including it as an important component of its new policies and strategies. I think that's a great start. And I think just to start, as a former refugee, I can tell you that understanding people's lived experience is important to delivering effective programs that integrate all aspects of the nexus. People affected by crisis and conflict don't live in silos and therefore don't think they care or they think or care about the humanitarian development and peace in their daily lives. I think their primary concern is to make sure their family is safe, they have access to food, and to provide better future for their family, such as education and access to healthcare, which is a human right. And also people also want to have a voice in influencing the decisions made by others that affect their lives. So that just wanted to highlight that. And this is at the core of what we do here at the IRC, helping people whose lives and livelihoods are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, recover, and gain control of their future. Responding to their immediate needs while working with governments, private sectors, local partners, and other actors on the ground to strengthen systems, build social cohesion, and foster resilience against future shocks and crises. So I see there is a strong alignment between USAID's and IRC's definition of the nexus and the principles outlined earlier by Jesse. And at the IRC, we work through the arc of crisis, as we call it, in complex and challenging contexts that have been experiencing protracted crisis for many years, places like Afghanistan, DRC, Somalia, just to name a few. And again, we define the nexus as the strong interlinkages across the range of IRC programming interventions. These include direct service delivery to people in refugee and IDP settings, system strengthening of public institutions and civil society, and community accountability to support effective delivery of services, particularly in non-refugee and IDP settings. So just to highlight a few principles, I think our technical approach to operationalizing the nexus is built on 5 core principles, which are also key principles of the HDP Coherence programming report Jesse mentioned earlier. I'm not going to go into details of those, but just to name these 5, the first one is partnering first. So our new strategy commits to a partner first approach, shifting the organizational focus to strengthening local systems in all our work. The second one, context analysis and coordination. Third, adaptive management. Fourth, anticipatory action. And the fifth one, integrated cross-sectoral programming. And just I'm going to end by a quick example. For example, through our integrated health program in DRC, we are creating an enabling environment for an empowered health zone by strengthening health systems, governance, and leadership at provincial health zone and facility levels in targeted health zones. And the program supports access to quality health services while strengthening or integrating systems strengthening approaches and contexts that span across the nexus or arc of crisis. In some countries, IRC's work includes both acute emergency response, as we know, and also development work happening at the same time. So I think, as Jesse mentioned, so I think that sequencing, layering, I think that's a key part of it. So I'm going to stop here. Back to you, Aaron.
Great, thanks, Mustafa. So now maybe turning to Liz to think about the peace pillar of the HDP Nexus, which I think is sometimes the sort of the least developed piece of the puzzle. So Liz, I'm wondering, where do you think we can make gains on the peace dimension in our day-to-day work? Are there promising models that you see that we can be building on?
So thank you so much. And I also love this question because you're starting on the positive. Some of the research that we've come out with now in the peace sector is that when we immediately focus on the challenges and the problems, our brains get activated around fear and we completely start to shut down. So just by starting this out in this way, we've done a positive thing. And also just having this conversation today with USAID, this report, these are big positives. We don't have to make the case. And I'll go to the Global Fragility Act. It talks about integration in the law. And I recently was just in a DevEx article talking about, these aren't suggestions, this is a law. The US climate change strategy, we're talking about this. The US COVID strategy talks about all these second order issues. Now, they have to be implemented, they have to be funded. I don't agree that conflict is a second order issue, but I don't want to get people's brains focused in on the fear. So going back to the positive, when we say peace building now, other development sectors aren't, and policymakers from around the world aren't looking at us puzzled and saying, what is that exactly? USAID has a new bureau on conflict stabilization and prevention. So these are all really good, positive things. But we have examples of where things are working. The European Union asked Safer World to review their programming in Sri Lanka a couple years ago. And what resulted is they designed flexible responses to the conflict. They put in adapting instruments to strengthen conflict sensitivity in its work, building capacity of its partners to integrate these lessons learned into all their programs. And recently, an RFP that came out of the Peace IQC task order really took this approach into in what it put out in the Northern Triangle, because there was a realization at USAID that so much money was going to be going into the Northern Triangle. They wanted to try to make sure they got out ahead of it. So that's a positive. We know the education sector has been out in front of this for more than a decade now. But the health and humanitarian sectors, for example, have really struggled with us. And when I say with us, we'll get to the challenges because it's not a one-sided problem. I am very clear that the peace building community has contributed to these issues. But we already started looking at this from the health sector before COVID. And I'm not saying, don't let a crisis go to waste, but the health sector right now, what's been happening with COVID has been extremely helpful to make this case. And that is something, we talk about a lot of this stuff in theory, and we've been able to really look at it in practice. So even before COVID, interaction, a lot of AFP members, humanitarian health, got together with USAID and looked at what happened in the DRC with Ebola. Looking at the fact that, you can't just go in and be like, okay, we're doing great stuff. We're preventing, we're trying to stop the spread of Ebola. People will love us because of that. Health clinics were being bombed. It was exacerbating the conflict, what was happening there. And together with USAID, health sector, humanitarian sectors, the peace building sectors, we actually started sitting down and asking ourselves, what is not working? What are we doing wrong? And what is working? And there we saw the health sector and the peace building sector be able to pivot and actually start addressing those issues in DRC. There was a lot of learning that came out of there. Right now, WHO has created a health and peace building program. That's the WHO, that's the UN. I mean, that's, I said this a lot. I mean, moving a lot of these, whether it's the UN bureaucracy or USAID, I mean, this is a bureaucracy, and trying to turn it is pretty, it takes a lot. So the fact that we're seeing this come out with the COVID crisis is really impressive. We had a WHO health and peace building person from their program at the AFP conference that just happened with USIP last week or 2 weeks ago. And one of the things they said is, COVID is taking place, 70% of disease outbreaks, not even COVID, are taking place in conflict affected areas. And in Africa with COVID, we know that 40%, you're having about 40% vaccinations. Well, guess who's left out? Displaced people, ethnic minorities, those with less power. So we're able to really look at real time. USAID Africa, West Africa, is doing incredible work at looking at, and this shows you, it's not just, going to the health sector and saying you have to make sure that peace is, in your programming. It's a two-way street. It's also how you take peace programming and impact health. And that's what USAID West Africa is doing. They really looked at the disinformation and how to adapt their peace building programs. They used the Nigerian herder conflict program and information disinformation. So there's a lot of really positive things, and that's really what I wanted to focus in on, and that it's also a two-way street. It's not just looking at other sectors and saying what you're doing wrong. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Liz. So maybe now turning to Dustin from your experience working in Somalia, wondering what your experience are in particular with shock responsive programming and putting that into practice. What are some successes that come to mind, but then also some obstacles that have stood in the way?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, a big success is just when you see a long-term development program already on the ground, responding to a new emergency before, new humanitarian funding can be mobilized. That's when we know that we've seen things are working right. I think Somalia is a context where we need to build long-term resilience as well as durable solutions programs for IDPs while responding to emergency humanitarian needs almost every year. A little while back, we had a big a flood, which happens, almost every year in some part of Somalia. And I remember we were gathering some partners together, mostly humanitarian partners, to do a rapid needs assessment and that kind of thing. And we contacted one of the resilience programs on the ground, a resilience program focused mostly on agriculture. And they said, oh yeah, we launched a response last week. We did cash for this many people. We did mobilized our farmer field schools, etc. Thought, wow, our humanitarian kind of apparatus was just working on the needs assessment side, and we had a long-term program already with people on the ground already responding. That's exactly the type of, I think, responsibility we want to see across the kind of the corners of the HDP community. One thing we've realized is that, for Somalia's context at least, the conventional emergency to recovery to development progression isn't always the right sequencing approach to programming. Instead, we've seen, as I said, some of the fastest and most contextually tailored humanitarian responses launched off the back of long, ongoing development actors, or in some cases, peace building actors. And, they already had funded staff on the ground in communities where the disaster either is happening or in many cases hasn't happened yet, but because they're on the ground, they can see it coming. A lot of people will say, well, you need flexibility for that. And, that definitely stands in the way of a lot of partners. But we've seen some really bold and creative resilience and peace building partners putting together, first of all, strategically flexible budgets that allow them to respond to, localized emergencies without asking for reward modifications or even donor approval. And we've also seen some donors, blending humanitarian development and peace building objectives into one activity. And time and again, the organizations implementing those types of activities emerge as the thought leaders in HDP cohesion and in their own sectors. And over time, it's those programs that have really grown into some of the best funded initiatives in the country. So this is what we've seen happen in Somalia, and I think that the product of looking more holistically across the HDP Nexus is really paid dividends for the type of programming we do, but also has really transitioned some of our partners to a whole nother level. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dustin. So last but not least, turning to Dina. So Dina, in your experience in various roles at Usaid and now at Mercy Corps, wondering how you see HDP coherence working in action, and is there a recipe for success?
Thanks, Erin, and hey, everyone. It's great to be on this panel. I see there are some 300 people on the line, which I think is just testament to just how important the conversation is and how interested people are in it. In reading over the new paper, I've really been reflecting on the variety of iterations this conversation has had over many years, and in each phase of the discussion, as slow or as frustrating as it's sometimes seen, I really do see significant improvements. And I think Mustafa and others have highlighted that. But in the mid-90s, when we were grappling with Nexus issues, the agency realized it didn't even have any tools to tackle the P in the HDP Nexus, the peace component. That's when OTI was created, and eventually the Office of Conflict Mitigation and Management. And of course, the Resilience Initiative, which began in the mid-2000s, really gave another huge push to this avenue of HDP coherence. And it led to super important ways, as we've been hearing about how changing how Usaid does business. And now these principles of actions, I think, serve furthering the conversation. So first and foremost, in terms of when it's working, it's when you have really strong, sustained focus on the agenda and really strong leadership, as the USAID has so often demonstrated, and also leaders all around the architecture of aid who care about it. Within Mercy Corps, we really see coherence when leaders incentivize people to create thoughtful processes and systems that build this coherence agenda. And I'm thinking of our team in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we're fortunate enough to have relief, development, peace resources with some flexibility that allows us to, they're available simultaneously, they're being layered and really allowing us to think about the coherence across them. And in that case, we have development work that's focusing on water services and infrastructure. We're able to combine that with a governance and peace program that's strengthening both demand for water services and addressing water-related conflicts. And on top of that, a humanitarian program responsive to WASH needs of communities where there are IDPs. So just as your paper outlines the importance of backbone support, which Jesse so well described, even inside an individual organization like Mercy Corps, we need to bring folks together around different projects, and the backbone function we're creating within our own organization is really key, I think, to some of the success. It has to involve joint work planning and monitoring, and really significant conversations around how long-term partnerships and systems change can effectively integrate with household level interventions that are so often what you see at the humanitarian side. And finally, I think for us, one of the recipes of success in recent years has been the resilience framing as a really powerful entry point for the conversation around coherence. It moves us quickly away from our stovepipes, the conversation about, well, I'm peace and your relief and we're development, to I think, much more useful focus around strengthening people's ability to cope, adapt, and thrive, all of which each of the different stakeholders bring something complementary to bear. And I think, as Mustafa said, or as Jesse said, I think, people are nexus dwellers fundamentally, so they don't really appreciate the distinctions. And so resilience is one of those avenues to HDP coherence that moves us right into sort of the community partnership agenda. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Dina. So unfortunately, we're running a bit short on time. This is such a rich conversation. We could, I'm sure, keep going for much longer, but we want to get also to the broader Q&A. So maybe one kind of last question for all of the panelists. We can do sort of a lightning round. So I think the main question is, what do you want to see next in this conversation at USAID? Is there low-hanging fruit on the one hand that we, USAID, or our partners can focus on? And then sort of thinking longer term, I think we've identified a number of deeper, more structural challenges. What are the kind of practical ways that we can be making inroads on those now? And then, of course, if there's anything else that you wanted to mention that you didn't get a chance to, please do that. So maybe turning back to Mustafa again to weigh in on that.
Thanks, Aaron. I promise I'll be quick. So I'll highlight three things in terms of, I think, moving forward in terms of next steps. First, I think there's a need to break down the funding silos to achieve lasting impact. I think that's key. This includes silos between humanitarian development funding, which have different timelines and restrictions, and funding to deliver more integrated programs, as Dean and other colleagues mentioned. Second one, funding that is multi-year and flexible is needed to enable implementing partners like the IRC to support immediate life-saving activities while simultaneously identifying opportunities for resilience building to shocks and system strengthening of service delivery organizations. And the third point is that donors need to facilitate joint funding streams managed across their humanitarian, development, and peace teams for protracted crises to support investments in Nexus programming. So there is a need for more funding streams that seek deliberately to connect crisis response with peace building and protracted crisis. And last not least, and in places where donors have funded separate programs, it remains important for them to still support mechanisms for national level coordination. I think this will ensure that funding streams are tied to a national strategy and work towards some collective outcomes. And one last point I'd like to make is that, and I think as the largest donor in the world, the US government and USAID is uniquely placed to set the tone and show leadership on breaking down these silos and realizing the vision for more effective programs and for the people that we serve. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you, Mustafa. Over to Liz.
Okay, so my lightning round. Really quick, and this is going to be actually focused a lot on the peace building community. What we have heard from our humanitarian and health and other development sectors is how we talk about it, how we talk about these issues. If people don't want to talk about conflict, don't talk about it. Talk about it in a sense of risk. How we measure it. We have to be able to come with very succinct measurements. What are we looking at in terms of, disinformation? It's not just about, your education outcomes, but what does that look like with peace building? And I have to say, Mercy Corps is one of AFP's members, and they do this really well, and they really look into it. So there is research there on how to do this. We have to simplify it. We can't make it a PhD. We can't be only pointing out the problems and the mistakes, like, see, you did this conflict. One of the other things we know is that health or education, a humanitarian, they're like, look, we don't want to become experts on conflict. Well, you don't have to be. How you build programs so that, you sub or you partner with other organizations like Mercy Corps, like Safer World, like International Alert, like others, those organizations that are already on the ground that understand the conflict dynamics. So those are some really important pieces. But I'm also going to say this, we have the Global Fragility Act, and it talks about integration, but it has to be implemented. One of the really big misses, in my opinion, was the COVID strategy. We've been talking about all of this, and then a COVID strategy comes out that talks about it in a very siloed way: humanitarian assistance, health, and then another pillar that has everything else in the kitchen sink put in there, and talking about it as a second order issue. That's not going to get us where we need to go. So it's not only about putting it in these policies and regulations, but we also have to really think about how we implement it. And this is a cultural change, and it's hard. It's not easy. If it was easy, we could all do this. But it also, you have to get into the unsexy part of things, like ongoing contracts and earmarks, procurement. And that's when it gets also really hard, but it really is this incredible culture change.
Thank you, Liz. Dustin?
Thanks. Yeah, I'll try not to repeat what Liz said, because I think it makes a lot of sense. I think first, just a low-hanging fruit. I think that when forming, partnerships, include actors that are diverse from each the humanitarian development and peace building space, bring them together, even if it's funded by one sector, and get those diverse mandated agencies working on the same project and require them to co-locate. That's what we've seen work time and again. I think when we talk about longer term, and also what I'd like to see the next conversation, I think it has to do with finding constructive opportunities to help all staff, but particularly our seasoned staff and decision makers, to kind of evolve their professional identity away from just a single sectoral narrative. I do this and therefore I am this one thing. We want to help people change how they identify themselves, to tell their story in a way that articulates their contribution to each of the humanitarian development and peace building objectives. And, you know, there's no reason we all can't see ourselves as practitioners of all three. And in doing that, I think HDP coherence will become a natural part of our thinking instead of something else. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dustin. And then Dina, and then I think we're going to shift it to the Q&A.
Thanks, Aaron. Couple top line things that are priorities, I think. The first I would say is recommitting to conflict sensitivity as just a minimum standard for all relief and development actors. It seems to be it should be a given at this point in time, but really it is far from being applied systematically. So I think we need to double down on that. I think we need to stay vigilant in sustaining development dollars in fragile contexts. And it's not a given that development actors want to go to these fragile places. And it's absolutely vital for the reasons Dustin talked about, the potential for transforming how we actually respond to crises. And so this goes far. I would add that those development programs need to have a peace component in them, because in these fragile contexts, we know that to achieve sustainable development gains, you're going to have to deal with the shocks of conflict. And so I think that is something that we want to see investments in development dollars with peace components. And then I would say in terms of low-hanging fruit, it's not low-hanging fruit, but I think it's an opportunity. And that's the expected eventual, I think, strategy for the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. As Mustafa mentioned, Usaid is uniquely placed to drive change, and to see a really powerful vision laid out in that strategy for how the global business model for recurrent and protracted crises needs to shift, and the role that Usaid can play in doing that through the HDP Nexus and through all the different tools that BHA brings to bear in collaboration with others. I think it's just a huge opportunity. And then finally, in terms of low-hanging fruit as well as a challenge, I would point to the very live case study we have unfolding right now in the Horn of Africa in terms of the response to the massive historic drought. It's a huge opportunity to challenge ourselves, to put into practice all we already know about what works, and to set up a learning agenda to see, how we can continue to grow and evolve. So are the development programs there shock responsive and timely in pivoting or layering new dimensions to protect gains? Are we building on the relief responses to mitigate the worst effects of the crisis and effectively using markets and social systems to respond where we can? And are we assessing how the drought interplays with current communal tensions and the opportunities or risks inherent in how we help communities cope with the crisis? So I would really love to see us kind of focus on a live case study. As Dustin said, it's in the actual moment, in an actual place and time where we bring people together around a common problem set that we can see both change and learn a lot. Thanks.
Thank you, Dina. So I want to just thank all of the panelists for your really thoughtful insights. We're not done yet, but this has just been a great discussion, and I'm going to hand it over to Jessie to help moderate the Q&A.
Awesome. Aaron, thank you. And thank you to all our panelists. I'm going to see how many of these questions we can get through. There's a lot of interesting ones in the chat so far. So my first question is for Dustin, and it combines two of the questions I'm seeing. The overarching question is, it's basically a recipes for success question, and it's what are the specific contributing factors for a mission to successfully adopt the HDP Nexus approach? But there was another question too that I just want to note to for Dustin. Another person particularly was curious how you bring development folks along to be thinking more clearly about the humanitarian and peace side of the house, and how you bring that into that equation. So Dustin, I'm curious from you, and you've been touching on this, but I don't know if you want to crystallize those kind of like that recipe for success. And then from your perch in particular, I'm curious what you think might be different or especially important for development folks in the conversation.
You know, in Somalia, we've seen a lot of leadership out of the humanitarian space because it's been the best funded historically. And so we've seen more humanitarian actors working up or moving into more of the development and peace building space than the other direction. But I think first and foremost, the first opportunity is partnerships. You know, bring something to the table, start small, but get involved with a sector that is not your sector. And over time, opportunities tend to kind of emerge. So that an investment has to happen there for each organization if they want to move into this space. It's not about waiting around, you know, in another country for the right, you know, funding opportunity to come around and put it all together for you. More often than not, the programs that are investing their time, getting involved one way or another into planning and understanding the strategies of other sectors, they're the ones that are in the know, making partnerships and are forming these kinds of more innovative programs. On the donor side, it's happened a few different ways. I mean, on one hand, sometimes we see within a donor office, you know, the right gel of people get together and they come up with a really creative project. But more often what we've seen are partners come up with better ways of doing programming and in the long term bringing their donors along in the process. And we've definitely, you know, I mean, again, some of our more innovative programs have been asked, well, how did you get the donor to agree to that? And for a lot of them, it was doing co-creation, you know, bringing the wider donor community, coordination community along in the thought process of why certain projects are needed. And sooner or later, it's not always USAID. One donor will come to the table because it makes sense. And when that proof of concept is made, another will come and so on and so forth. Does that answer your question, Jessica?
I thought that was great. Yeah, Dustin, thank you. And I have my next question ready, and I'm sending this to Liz. So I want to honor the fact that we have a diverse group of folks on the line. So the question is, can you elaborate on the relevance of the do no harm approach and work? And I might just broaden that to do no harm, conflict sensitivity. But Liz, I was wondering if I could put you on the spot to just give a bit of a pitch for why this matters to our audience of folks that's coming from, you know, humanitarian development piece in the room. Over to you.
So Dina, so thank you. So Dina said it, you know, we haven't implemented conflict sensitivity completely, not even sometimes in peace building programs. You know, I have a drawer full of, you know, do no harm of examples of where we, you know, forgot about it in a sense. So what do we know? We know that, you know, the argument we used to make in the early 2000s was, you know, you can do all this development work and then a conflict can come through and wipe it out. So we need to be thinking about that. We know when we put millions of dollars into a country, you're going to have an action. You're going to have an action. You're going to have a reaction. And we don't have to go any further than looking at the United States right now and what we're seeing with COVID. Not just about getting vaccines in people's arms, not just, you know, wear your masks. Anytime you're seeing something like that, you're having a reaction. So it's understanding how your action is going to impact, looking forward on that and saying, okay, this could be the outcome. What could we do to mitigate this? That's just in the conflict sensitivity of do no harm. You know, that's one part of it. The second part is, and this is how can development, humanitarian assistance be part of the peace dividends? And that's what the WHO is saying on health and peace. How do you go further than that as well? So the first is just don't make it worse, right? You know, don't make it worse and think, you know, try to game out what could happen if you do X. And then, you know, think about, okay, well, you know, if we're doing this, how can it also impact peace, right? So it's not just the, you know, the do no harm piece of it, and people forget that second part of it. I'll stop there, but I think that's, you know, we don't have to look any further than COVID and looking at the United States to see how are how actions can have negative impacts.
Liz, thanks so much for that. I'm seeing a cluster of questions that I also want to combine, and I'm going to send this to Dina, but other folks can chime in too. Oh, Dina, let's get you to chime in actually on Liz's comments first, and then I'll get to this next question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, having done the early training on Do No Harm when I was at AID in the mid-90s, and it was just widely used, and even OFDA at the time required an annex from implementing partners on how you were going to be conflict sensitive in your response, and that's kind of fallen away a little bit for some reason. So at Mercy Corps, we're working with the Collaborative for Development Action to do an online Do No Harm training to refresh the skill set across all of our teams, and eventually we'll have that and the toolkit and some options for in-person collaboration around the training available, hopefully to the wider global international community. But I really do think that, as Liz said, it's about looking at how that program intersects with social, cultural, political, economic issues that you're in, to the extent, you know, that your program is impacting those things. How do you avoid doing harm, but how do you also connect people, looking at the dividers and connectors? How do you advance peace just by the way you show up in a community, and the opportunities to build on people's capacities for peace, which is, you know, just another opportunity to look at the opportunity as opposed to the problem set, which I think can lead to different solutions.
Dina, thanks for that. And I'm going to swing back to you and Mustafa, I think, for this next question, but really others should chime in as well. So there's a couple questions that have all been dancing around funding constraints, basically this idea that the pie is getting smaller. One question asks, how do we ensure we're able to respond to the ongoing immediate humanitarian needs while working towards the true nexus with a shrinking donor landscape? Others talk about funding imbalances where there is a lot for emergency response and we don't have funding on the DA side. So I'm curious with our multi-mandated organizations on the call in particular, if you just have any reflections on that funding landscape, and you know, maybe you share the frustration, or maybe you have a note of optimism. Either way, I turn to you. So I'll go to Dina first and then Mustafa, but then others chime in too.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been really more focused on the imbalance of funding, you know, how little there is for peace programming and how there needs to be more with development money. I mean, the humanitarian accounts have grown, I think, by 25% in the recent years. And the FY22 budget passes Congress, you're going to have a historic increase in development assistance money. Not huge, but I think it's at least 10% or more. So at least on the US government side, we're moving in the right direction. I think it is. And the Global Fragility Act monies are also in that FY22. There are opportunities for more peace building there. I think it is incumbent on all of us to continue our advocacy around the importance of getting those things a little bit more aligned in terms of dollar amounts. I do think that there is also, though, a lot of opportunity to just do better with what we have, to be more efficient and more effective. We have huge sums of money for just looking at the humanitarian accounts and all of the ways we're learning about how to change the way we do humanitarian response, to build on social systems, to build more on market systems, are all opportunities that are within our power to take advantage of right now, as well as, you know, to integrate in new ways and to have improved impact and be more efficient and effective right now. So I think we don't want to get too bogged down in that, but we do need to continue to advocate for better balance on the dollar funds.
Mustafa, do you want to add on this question?
Sure, thanks, Jessica. And I'll try to kind of answer it from a slightly different perspective, from local partnership perspective, and putting our local actors and I think their needs and context at the center. So I think I'll just stress on the importance of nothing about us without us approach by putting local voices in the center in our decision making and program design, rather than looking from the funding perspective. And I think in the last 5 years or so, we have made some significant progress in terms of including through the development of our partnership excellence for equality and results systems, or we call it peers. I think so. Currently, we're currently working with Global South, civil society networks such as NEAR. So for those of you who don't know NEAR, it's a network of international and local actors. So IRC and NEAR, we're partnering to advance collaborative design practices in the sector, so developing localized financing mechanisms, and also conducting a joint quality review of our peer system. So I think once this is finalized, so this tool is gonna be open source and available to all as a resource in the sector. So I just wanted to stress on the kind of commitment to a partner-first approach and shifting the organizational focus to more of a kind of strengthening local systems in all our work. And I think one of the advantage of to partner-first approach we see is that it can mitigate the negative impacts of somewhat these artificial silos in the international system. I think I'll stop there, Jessica. Over to you.
Awesome, Mustafa. Thank you for that one. And I have another actually related question coming your way. Well, okay, I'll skip it so you get a break, and then I'll come back to you. But this next question is, we've had a couple questions that are just engaging with that idea of crowding in resources into a particular subnational zone or particular geography as one kind of like useful way to make HDP coherence, turn into action. But someone's asking, how do we deal with the necessary harmonization and procedures and all of that? So I'm wondering, I want to send this to Dustin from a mission perspective, but then I'm curious for anyone else to chime in as well. Maybe Dina, for anyone who has been doing the day-to-day work of sequencing, layering, and integrating, perhaps investing in backbone support to grease the wheels to make that happen. I'm curious if folks just have any takeaways for what it takes to make that work in a particular geography. So I will go to Dustin first, but then open it up to other panelists too.
So yeah, in a nutshell, sequencing, layering, integrating, how to do it. I mean, we've all been tongue-tied with it for a long time, and I think that first of all, sequence. There's been a lot of talk internally about should we focus more on layering and integrating because sequencing's too. We've seen great sequencing happening within large multi-sectoral, multi-year programs. They've really got sequencing right, but we've really struggled to get sequencing right at a donor level. And a lot of it's because we're in countries with, competing emergencies that are cyclically going back and forth between, emergency and development situations. In terms of picking layering, that's a lot easier. It has to do with coordination on one hand, but also making sure that you pick some sort of a resilience focal zone, or you overlap your programming in a coherent way. And an important piece of that is that if you're a development program and you want to layer with humanitarian projects in some way, pick the areas that have the greatest humanitarian need. Don't go to the areas where development's easiest. That sort of stuff is the way that you got to think from the other parts of the HDP triangle's perspective to think, where are we going to go to where those other partners are most likely going to be? And then it works pretty well. And a lot of our missions, our resilience-focused countries especially, all have resilience-focused zones that we're working to do that now. Integrating is the hardest of the three. And really it has to do with, at a local level, getting staff together to figure out how they can come up with better ways to do programming, and then bringing those back up the decision-making chain to make sure that they happen. But this is where we're talking about, the value of our programs being greater than the sum of our parts, and that takes a case-by-case, decentralized decision-making kind of model to figure out where those opportunities really exist. Thanks, Jesse.
Awesome, Justin, thank you for that. And I want to open it up. Would anyone else like to chime in on this? And it's okay if not, because I have one more question I'm going to try to squeeze in.
I think I would just add that, the Backbone project activities in Somalia and the Sahel, Mercy Corps is involved in those, as well as in Zimbabwe. I think we're seeing a lot of progress on the collaboration and the learning. I do think it would be great to see more of the scenario planning that would allow us to trigger shock responsive reaction. We're all on the same page about how early that has to happen and what needs to happen. Some of the scenario planning, I think there's an opportunity to use the backbones to do more scenario planning and to trigger earlier action for response. So I would add that in as an elaboration of some of Dustin's learning.
Thanks, Tina. And I'm going to ask one last question before we pivot to the next portion. We're getting a question that's basically about, are any of you hearing feedback from local partners, local actors, in terms of what they need or would like to be able to participate in some of these processes, whether that's in coordination platforms, being more engaged, and no worries if that's not something that's top of mind, but I'm curious if anyone has heard some of that feedback that they'd just like to share. We've been making this connection between HDP coherence and localization. When it comes to local actors and local partners, have you been hearing anything you'd want to share for what it would take to be more inclusive and to have local actors just more part of this conversation with us? So I know Mustafa had related thoughts, so I might turn to Mustafa first if you have anything there, but then I'll open it up.
Sure, happy to just Jessica. I think I'll just mention one example, and I think I mentioned it earlier as well, that this partnership that you're working with the NEAR network. So it's a network of local international actors. And we have been working with them to develop this collaborative design approach. So through this report, we have been working very closely with local actors through interviews and hearing what their thoughts and views are. And we are in the final stages of making this publicly available. So I think that would answer some of the the questions that we are hearing in the chat. So I would just say stay tuned for that report, and I think we're going to have a launch event or something as well to kind of share furthermore on what our local partners and local actors are really thinking.
Thanks, Mustafa.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to hop in and say, there's nothing special about, locally led in this process that isn't, part of the larger problem around more locally led or more inclusion around local actors. AFP just put out a policy where we spent about a year listening to other donors, Usaid, and it goes back into what I was talking about, a culture change, more co-design, but there's a lot of really, again, unsexy things that you have to talk about: procurement reform, taking risk. So I'll put that policy in the chat. But one thing I do want to point out, because we have Usaid and others on this line, is that, one thing we don't want to see is, in the process of moving towards locally led, is kind of the demonization of international organizations or partners, right? Knowing that they're not mutually exclusive and there is a partnership there. So figure out what's, working. And a lot of times in, conflict affected places, it is difficult for local organizations to operate freely as well. And so, they work with international organizations. So I'll put this policy in the chat. But like I said, I don't think there's any special thing on HDP that isn't applied for how do we, make locally led more part of all the processes.
I'll jump in too, and just maybe it goes without saying in terms of how engaging communities, and Mustafa said it so well, but we keep the conversation about us and our funding streams, we're never going to go far enough to effectively engage. I mean, a community, they don't want to talk about relief, development, and peace. They want to talk about their well-being and what it is it's going to take for them to continue to progress towards well-being despite COVID and conflict and poverty issues in their communities. And so if we have to mobilize around a dialogue process that allows us not only to hear what they have to say about their future well-being, what they want, but then figure out how our resources, it's up to us, figure out how our resources can meet their needs. So in a way, we just, I think, need to continue to flip the conversation away from funding streams and more towards, what do resilient communities need to be to advance their well-being.
Dina, I love that as an ending note for the panel. I want to just quickly say a huge thank you to our panelists and to our moderator, Aaron. We are now going to be turning to these kind of like rapid fire closing reflections from USAID colleagues. So this is just going to be a quick session where we're hearing from our USAID colleagues representing education, global health, conflict and violence prevention, to just be reflecting on today's event, HDP Coherence, linking it to where they sit and the road ahead. So with that, I am going to turn to Nina Weisenhorn first, Senior Advisor with the Education and Crisis and Conflict team at USAID. Nina, thank you so much for joining us for this rapid fire closing reflection session, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Jessie, and thanks to all the panelists. This was such a rich discussion and got me thinking in many new ways, so thank you. When I reflect on today's conversation and the question posed by Alexius Butler at the outset, how do we take action today? In the education sector, we are uniquely focused on the shared outcome of well-being and sustained education outcomes for children and youth in crisis. USAID is committed to this population and working together with our colleagues in the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance to effectively sequence, layer, and integrate our programs in a way that does, as Dina highlighted, ensure that we can sustain well-being for these populations. Because like Mustafa said, to a child in an internal displaced camp or whose education has been disrupted due to COVID, it does not matter. And to their parents, sustaining their education is essential for the well-being of their family and to contribute to the stability and the peace of their community. So when I think about next steps, COVID has really laid bare for the education sector the need for increased investments in preparedness. And we have to leverage the tools and resources that already exist and that we have already integrated into many programs in education, and which Liz and Dina also pointed out. And these are the tools and assessments to understand conflict sensitivity and to understand risks and the relationship between contextual risks and the education system, as well as vulnerability across the different actors within the education system to those shocks or stressors. And so while we may be leaning in from the development space to understand contextual risks, prepare better for the variety of shocks and stressors, we also seek greater collaboration and hope to see equally leaning in from humanitarian actors and greater collaboration with actors in the peace space, as well as cross-sectoral programs, to be able to leverage the assets the education system brings to the Humanitarian-Development-Peace Nexus and resilience and well-being overall. We see that there are key factors that the education system can contribute to this symbiotic relationship, and that's the ability to work at scale in countries, the value and demand for education, and the fact that education provides a permanent or portable asset that populations can take with them, even in times of crisis, and cannot be taken away. And so we look forward to continuing this conversation and engaging with many of you, either across that nexus of humanitarian development and peace space, as well as across different sectors. Thanks again for the rich discussion. It's been a pleasure to listen to you all and reflect on what it means for the education sector.
Nina, thank you so much for that. I am now going to turn to Nefra Faltis, Senior Child Health Advisor at USAID. Nefra, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessie, for the opportunity, and to all of the panelists and the participants for really an incredibly rich discussion. I've also been reading a number of the comments and the questions in the chat with great interest in learning from all of you. So for global health, an important point of departure for us in positioning these programming considerations has been the recognition that an estimated 1 in every 70 people in the world is living in crisis, and that there's an increasing confluence of those living in crisis with those living in fragile, conflict-affected, and other vulnerable settings. And these realities, as others on the line today have noted, have been exacerbated by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and other health and non-health shocks and stresses. And WHO estimated last year that about a quarter of the population lives in these kinds of settings. And these settings also account for an estimated 60% of preventable maternal deaths, over half of all under 5 deaths in the world, about 45% of newborn deaths, and an estimated 80% of major infectious disease outbreaks, many of them vaccine preventable. In advancing HDP coherence to ensure that no one is left behind in our health programming and beyond, we also recognize that we need to give greater attention to the world's growing youth population, the urban poor, mainstreaming gender considerations, including to critically expand equitable access to family planning, and those increasingly on the move, just to name a few. So with these kinds of statistics in mind and so many countries off track and even at risk of backsliding in their progress to meet Sustainable Development Goal mortality reduction and other targets by 2030, certainly there's simply no way that health sector investments alone will be sufficient to support countries in those efforts. And USAID has a vision for health system strengthening 2030 that critically recognizes all this. And it draws from many of the key HDP coherence principles that we've highlighted today around the importance of integrated, systems-based, locally led, and inclusive approaches to strengthening health systems, which of course is more critical than ever. I think many of us are also familiar with the maxim, prioritize prevention always, development when possible, and humanitarian action when necessary. So when we think about as USAID and in global health about how we can uphold our end of the bargain in that respect, we think about what our shared responsibilities mean for the way we work internally. Certainly procurement reform, layering, sequencing, and integrating across health areas and with other sectors are important tools in this toolbox. But we've also been working to advance our own efforts to better integrate risk and crisis sensitivity analysis into routine monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive management. And I'd argue that at USAID, these efforts have largely been driven by our food security, food assistance, and longer-term humanitarian assistance programming colleagues. In the Bureau for Global Health, we recognize that there's a significant need to elevate this kind of all hazards approach to better adapt and target our programming according to the complex risk profiles of our program participants, particularly for more equity-driven, do no harm grounded programming. And understanding the complex risks that individuals and groups are variably exposed to and why, and incorporating more participatory qualitative methods into these analyses, we think can contribute to more drilled down understandings of the drivers of health inequities. Use of these kinds of methods, we think, can also inform more user-centered program design and support efforts to decolonize global health. That said, capacity building support is still needed, quite frankly, within the development side of the house in global health, which can be challenging in an emerging field and in contexts where timely data availability and quality are already often poor. But we need to be able to do this, to be able to work closely with our implementing partners so that we can operationalize some of these key concepts. Thanks.
Nefra, thank you so much for that. And I'm going to turn to our last closing reflection speaker, David Alpher, Conflict and Violence Prevention Integrator. David, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me on, and I will try to keep this brief. One of the things that strikes me most about this discussion is not just the recognition that increasingly we the community of practice, be the conflict, development, or humanitarian, find ourselves co-located in these spreading, conflating crises. That's a absolutely critical and a growing area of importance to recognize for this nexus. But I'm also really heartened to hear a much more subtle reading of this, that when we get down towards the toughest nuts to crack, the most grinding poverty, the last percentages that we can't get vaccinated, that we are no longer seeing specific dynamics of economics or logistics, but that conflict dynamics are becoming wrapped into the problem. When we talk about the unvaccinated, we are not talking about improving our logistics to get to more people as much as we are talking about who is excluded from those vaccinations and why, who is shut out, who is refusing, and why. When we talk about the hardest layers of poverty to crack, it's a similar problem. We're not talking about economic difficulties anymore, numbers of jobs, numbers of markets. We're talking about who is shut out of access to those markets, who is shut out of access to those jobs. These are conflict dynamics, and that's a very powerful reading of Nexus. As was also pointed out, I'm very happy to say, in order that we can get through these tough nuts, this does not require education and agriculture and economics people to suddenly become peace builders as well. That's the other reason why the Nexus is there. USAID has the Bureau of Conflict Prevention and Stabilization, the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention. We are investing in the staff and the resources to apply to these problems in concert with the rest of these sectors. That's very important to recognize. Critical, especially because the sustainability and the effectiveness of development and humanitarian programming also depends on recognizing where those conflict dynamics are intrinsically tied to the continuing dynamics. So this is an invitation to greater collaboration, an invitation to greater conversation, to looking into those tough nuts to crack and recognizing where one sector is, never has been, arguably, capable of taking care of all of these problems on their own, but that it requires the collective work across all of this nexus in order to get the most help to the people who need it the greatest. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much, and really thrilled to see this conversation happening the way it has been.
Awesome, David, thank you so much. And I wanted to flag, we're going to go a couple minutes over. I hope folks can stay with us. If you can't, that's okay too. But to close our time together, I'm very happy to welcome Amy Tohill-Stoll, co-chair of the Resilience Leadership Council and Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. Thank you very much, Amy, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessie, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and I'm thrilled, actually, to be closing this event today, and the opportunity to provide some remarks, especially as someone who has worked across the humanitarian and development spectrum throughout my career and in conflict settings, and where I've seen the limitations of siloed programming, as well as the benefit of greater collaboration across sectors. Up front, I'd like to thank our speakers and our participants for joining us today and for pushing us to think critically. And as well, I'd like to thank those organizations that contributed to our knowledge base and learning as part of the process of developing the report that's been shared today. The discussion over the last 2 hours has been rich, and I think challenges all of us to put more deliberate attention and learning toward Nexus programming approaches that will maximize the impact of our collective efforts. As the Deputy Coordinator of the Resilience Leadership Council, I'm really proud of this effort, and I'm also very proud of the work underway to revise our resilience policy for the agency, which also has a focus on humanitarian development and peace, and how we can more intentionally work in the Nexus space. This discussion and the report actually couldn't come at a more critical time, as the confluence of conflict, COVID-19, and climate change is dramatically increasing humanitarian needs around the world and also eroding development gains that we've worked so hard to achieve. It's only through an all-hands-on-deck approach in which we better leverage, integrate, and coordinate our programming across the Nexus that we'll be able to address the scope and the scale of today's challenges. In BHA, we've already seen how HDP coherence can have real impact at the field level, and particularly when local actors are at the center of our efforts. In fact, this is the heart of BHA's early recovery, risk reduction, and resilience programming, which aims to bring together our emergency and our non-emergency work under a framework that builds capacity at all levels to advance the sustainability of our assistance. As practitioners, we still have much to learn and much more work to do when it comes to strengthening coherence. But I think the principles, the programming approaches, and the best practices highlighted in the report and that we've discussed here today will help us to make tangible progress. In Usaid, we look forward to putting the recommendations of the report into action with the support of our implementing partners and continuing to work with you to further learn how to facilitate and make more effective our Nexus efforts. This includes, among other things, how we can more effectively promote coordination across the Nexus, provide increased programming flexibilities when we need to adjust our efforts, how we can better engage local partners and systems, how we can identify more effectively intersections across the HDP triangle, and also layer, sequence, and integrate our programming. I encourage each of the organizations to also take practical steps to promote HDP coherence and to identify new solutions that address longstanding institutional barriers that we know are challenging to our work. I also, just in closing, want to again thank everyone for coming together today to discuss this pressing issue in much more detail, and to think collectively how we can continue to advance our efforts to promote HDP coherence. We look forward to continuing to engage on this topic both internally and with our partners externally, with much more to come. Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much. And thank you for closing this event for us. I am just going to say a few last things as everyone moves on with the rest of their day. And if we can put the slides up again, we will just quickly share some other products that USAID has produced in this space. So, you know, as staff through the agency have been thinking about incorporating HDP coherence in their work throughout the program cycle, we have produced some sector-specific guidance in this space too. So we'll be dropping links in the chat. Oh, I think we're having trouble with the slides. So we'll drop the links to these products in the chat. One is a technical brief for practical programming ideas to improve HDP coherence for those in the WASH and water resource management space. We also have an excellent resource by the education team for HADA coherence as a white paper, and then another BHA-funded report by Feinstein on the Nexus. So please, you know, if you're interested in these programming considerations, please look out for those products as well. And otherwise, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone today. I'm really grateful to all of our speakers and to everyone in the audience for your excellent questions and the conversation. And I'm really looking forward to this being just a beginning in this space. So we look forward to being in touch with all of you up ahead with this work stream. And otherwise, thank you so much. And we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.